Welcome to our short video on early modern English for the Introduction to Grammar course at Southern Utah University. In this video, we want to talk about the time frame of the period where we would consider English being in the early modern period. We'll talk about some of the changes to early modern English, and then we'll talk a little bit about why we have spent time over these past few weeks talking about the history of English and how it relates to our course goals. So when is early modern English? Early modern English is part of this modern English or present day English that we speak, but it's a much earlier form of it. And as we mentioned previously, that Middle English, we tend to think of the end of that period being around when printing enters United Kingdom. And so in that period, we start seeing more kind of language standardization a little bit as we have printing and spelling, and we start to get more of a consensus across the British Isles of what is English, but there's still quite a bit of variation. Now it's during those next 200 years or so that we have Shakespeare writing plays, and so a lot of people associate modern English with Shakespeare English. But by the 17th century, we think of it being kind of the end of early modern English, and we move into other forms of modern English. And really what's happening by the 17th century is there's a greater push to start writing grammar books for English, establishing what are the rules for standard English, what does it look like? And so that's generally where we see the end of being the early modern English period, and we move into forms of English that look much more closely like what we deal with now. So what kind of changes happened during this period? Well, you may have heard before in other English courses or just in general reading about the Great Vowel Shift. Prior to this period, English sound and symbol correspondence more closely matched the way that vowels are represented in other European languages. So what we think of as the letter I was pronounced more like E, and so on, that the vowels had different sounds that more closely matched other European languages. But somehow during this period, we get this shift where the vowels have now shifted, and we think of our 5 short vowels and our 5 long vowels and a few others, and the correspondence to the symbol and the sound was different from what it used to be in English. During this period also, this causes some changes to the way verbs are formed. Previously, we used to have in English what were called weak verbs and strong verbs. And strong verbs were the type of verbs where the difference between present and past tense was represented by a vowel change. So for an example of that, sit and sat. Other verbs were more the weak form, where we just add the inflection to the end of the word. But partially because of this great vowel shift, sometimes the sound correspondence for strong verbs got confusing. And so we see fewer and fewer strong verbs and more weak verbs, or these regularized verbs where we just add the inflection at the end. And what's interesting is that there are some verbs that we use in English that have maintained these maybe irregular forms that we think of. And most often that happens when the verb is actually a frequently used verb. When something's used so frequently, people get used to the unusual nature of it, and they can remember it and use it correctly in that unusual, non-standard, non-regularized form. But when a verb is very infrequently used, it's harder for people to remember, oh, what was that specialized form? And so instead, eventually that verb just becomes regularized, where we just add the ed. So we see some of these changes happening during this period where more verbs are changing from maybe strong verbs to weak verbs. We think of the word, for instance, to be, right? We have I am, he is, and then we have was and were as past tense. So it's a much more complicated verb, but because we use it so frequently, we retain the irregular patterns in it. But other verbs that we use less frequently are just much easier just to turn into the ed endings. Think of the word go, for instance. We have go and goes, but then we have went. It doesn't look at all alike, and that's actually because it's a different verb. There is a verb to wend, okay, to wend your way. And somehow the past form of that, went, got used as the past tense of English, went. And so we've got this really weird use now in modern English. But because it's so frequently used, we are able to retain that unusual nature of that particular verb. There's also some changes to pronouns. Okay, you probably are already aware that in English we used to have a singular second person, thee, thou, thine. Okay, and that starts to disappear where it's just replaced with the plural form you. We use it in both cases, whether it's singular you or plural you. We just use you for both of them. There's also some changes in auxiliaries. And if you're really interested in learning more about these changes, I have linked on Canvas to 2 videos where an history of English professor goes through some of more of these changes in nouns, pronouns, verbs, adverbs, auxiliaries, and talks about how they changed during this period. So really, what's our goal then? If we're not going to focus on all these small changes, our discussion of the history of English, our goal here is to understand, again, that language changes over time, but also to recognize that there's regional differences. The way they used it in one region and another region differed, and eventually one of those won out, and that's what we generally use for standard English today. There's also social differences in English. Different groups of people have their own dialect or their own form of English that they use. And some of us will develop multiple forms of English that we use in different contexts, depending on our audience or our location. And those are the kinds of things we're going to explore for the rest of this course. So if you're really interested in history of English, there are entire courses that can cover this at universities. But our goal here is mostly to spend the rest of the semester now talking about different varieties of English and how that impacts grammar, and getting a better appreciation and understanding that all of these are valid forms of English, but understanding how they might be different can help us better communicate with others who use different forms of English, but also appreciate those differences without judging them or placing them in higher status one over the other. So we talked about the general time frame associated with early modern English. We highlighted just a couple changes that happened during this period, and then we tried to give a reasoning why a brief study of the history of English relates to our more general study of the grammar of English.